My first job when I was 15, 16 years old until I was 19 years old was as a fishing guide in Canada. And as a 15-year-old, 16-year-old, I was in the back of a boat, and there in the boat with me were two 50-year-old, 45-year-old, very successful businessmen. And I was in charge as a 15-year-old. And without, again, being conscious of it, and the best lessons that we learn are those, I think, that we're not conscious of. Without being conscious of it, I learned that I could be the leader by being the servant. That if I took really good care of these people, if I met them at their cabin in the morning with a hot pot of coffee as they were awakening and grabbed their fishing stuff for them and brought it down to the boat, if I just lavished them with service, that they would grant me authority. They would want me to take care of them if I demonstrated that I was doing an extraordinarily good job of taking care of them. The best job I did of taking care of them meant that they would just grant more and more authority to me. And so I was able to take two very successful businessmen on a 3 or 4 day fishing adventure and tell them what to do because they knew that I always had their best interests in heart, in mind. And so as I became a CEO of businesses, I came to learn, well, that's exactly how the very best employees want to be treated. They want to be cared for. They want to know that there's somebody legitimately looking out after their personal development that can say to them, we're not only going to get work accomplished here, but we're going to get work accomplished here in a way that's going to serve who you would like to be, that those folks, man, they want to work for you and they want to work really hard for you. So in my experience, when I find a business concept that has got both altruistic pleasure for me, I feel good when I'm a servant leader. I feel good walking into a room of people and genuinely caring for them, with them. But it also has such wonderful pragmatic value because the people who are in that room being cared for by me inevitably want to do their very best work for me. They want to accomplish that much more than they could have accomplished otherwise. And so it's got this great power of both creating the right vibe in the organization as well as the best performance of the organization. So much of my insight into the creative process comes from the fact that I just spent all my life outdoors or in a barnyard watching animals. And there are natural creative forces that exist. Again, the environment is a complex one. Right? Lots of independent individual entities in relationship with each other, responding to each other, adapting to each other is the world of nature. And there are some creative forces that you begin to identify that are natural creative forces that if you can plug into those creative forces, you've got that additional energy working for you. One of them is this quality of emergence. How interesting it is that a molecule of H2O doesn't suggest wetness. There's nothing about a molecule of H2O that in any way can be measured, suggested, analyzed, and determined, that there's a quality of wetness there. There isn't. It's only when enough of those molecules come in relationship to each other that this brand new, radically new quality of wetness emerges. And so when you have an appreciation for this wonderful bottoms-up self-organization that occurs in nature, and has this outcome of new qualities emerging, and you can begin to engage in the climate control leadership behavior that makes it most likely that those qualities that you would like to have emerge in my businesses. If you want to have a good creative idea, have lots of ideas. Linus Pauling, the only individual to have ever won 2 Nobel prizes as an individual in 2 different fields. I forget if one was medicine or chemistry and the other one was a peace prize. He says, you want to have a really good idea? Have lots of ideas. Well, nature demonstrates that, right? Nature shows how important it is to be throwing lots of effort out into the world with the hope that some of it is going to be successful. Nature also teaches us the power of the increment, right? It doesn't make a radical new step into a new environment. It slowly works its way. So there's lots of lessons that come from nature. We need to get out of our minds. For years, I've told students about how the status quo out in the world is a big challenge for your entrepreneurial effort. This research tells us that it's really our own status quo, our own behavior, our own common way that we always think about things that gets in the way of our entrepreneurial and our creative behavior. So there's a whole lot of research that tests different ways to get out of your mind. One of them that my Duke students have so much fun with is the research that shows that, yes, indeed, if you have a beer, you're going to be much more effective at a whole range of creative challenges than if you hadn't had that beer. And of course, they have a lot of fun with that one. Another one is that if you are a University of Indiana student and you're asked to solve a challenge there in Indiana, the originality, the amount of solutions that you come up with is much less than if you're trying to solve that same problem in India, right? To create that distance, to get a little bit out of your comfort, causes you to become more creative. So anything that you can do to get out of your common way of thinking. Are you somebody that always brings your problems into your home office? Well, maybe this morning you should take your problem to a walk out in the woods, which, oh, by the way, has an additional benefit because there's research that now shows that what the Lake Country poets knew instinctively, in fact, is true, and that is that when you reach your natural stride, when you begin to go for a walk and you reach your natural stride, your brain just comes alive in a way that it doesn't otherwise. Both hemispheres awaken and begin to communicate with each other. So there's another way to prompt your thinking is to go out and take a nice long walk. So the first steps for an entrepreneur who wants to start a new company, who doesn't yet fully have the idea, who's still working on an idea, who's still trying to contemplate an idea, is to begin to practice this ready, fire, aim bias for action. You've got an inclination, right? You have an interest. We're not operating in a vacuum. We're talking to an individual who has got some idea of some opportunity or some predilection of something that they want to explore. Given that that is so, Ready, Fire, Aim says, let's get started. And here's some ways to get started. One is to embrace a quality of wondering while you're wandering. Let's just get started. Let's go wonder while we're wandering. It's a Ready, Fire, Aim approach. But it has a couple of qualities to it that I think are really very useful. One is that it helps me remember that I'm humble, that I don't know. I'm wondering about what it is that I can do. It tells me that I'm asking lots of questions. Again, the wandering says that I'm out in the world, but that I'm out in the world appreciating that it's a circuitous path. It's an interest. Who knows the direction that I'm going to take? And it's playful. There's a playfulness to wondering while you're wandering that, again, reminds me that I need to bring a playful perspective. So let's wonder while we're wandering. Let's find friends fast, people who have got compatible interests, complementary interests, who maybe have some interesting vantage point that you don't have. And when we're finding friends fast, let's treat them with a servant leadership approach. Let's help them with their discovery process. Again, there's this wonderful human balance that wants to take place, that if I'm helping you, you're going to want to help me. Too often when we're working on a new idea, we feel like we want to hold it close. We don't want people to know about it. We're afraid that if it gets away from us, somebody else might do this. That might happen. But I think that when one realizes that if you boldly declare to your community that this is something that you're now interested in, you'll be delighted how frequently friends find you. How the universe turns towards you and says, oh, if that's something you're interested in, I am too. So there's another way to find friends fast is by declaring your interests. Be looking for opportunity. If we too quickly capture what we're trying to do in a plan, too often that keeps us from being opportunistic early on. And it is a momentum play. You are trying to develop momentum. And so when you can find the ball on the 10-yard line, to use an American football metaphor, so there's an early score, an easy score available to you, you certainly want to be looking for that in your early efforts. A mantra that's been embraced by so many is the idea of failing early, failing often, and let me add to that, failing cheap. And that's a wonderful bias for action, right? If I know that I'm going to be taking missteps, I'll go ahead and get started. I know I'm going to be taking missteps. I've given myself permission to take missteps. That gives me permission to get started. And that means I'm getting smart really, really fast about what it is that I'm trying to accomplish. What you're trying to accomplish as an early entrepreneur is the creation of something that you can invest, right? So you're building creative capital. If you're getting the human capital of getting smart really fast and the social capital of finding friends fast, it becomes creative capital when you bring it together that you're now prepared to invest in the early stages of your endeavor. The power of intentionality underlines so much of this. The generative way has two components to it. There's a generative mindset and a generative toolbox. And the generative mindset begins with the power of intentionality. If at this moment, right now, put the date down on your piece of paper and declare that at this moment, you're going to begin to see the world as a creatively entrepreneurial person sees the world. Make that intentional declaration. And if it's true, if it's authentic, if you mean that when you say that, you will in that very instant begin to see the world differently. You'll begin to see the world more consistent with a creatively entrepreneurial mindset. Now, all the great faiths understand this. All the great faiths, when they are bringing you into their faith, when you are a student of their faith, when you're a pilgrim, a novice, at some point you have to declare with intentionality that I am a Baptist, or that I am a Catholic, or I am a Muslim. At this point, you have to make an intentional declaration because they understand that in the moment of that intentional declaration, you will begin to see the world more consistent with their faith narrative. I don't have such a strict faith narrative, but in that moment of declaration, I'm convinced that you'll begin to see the world as a creatively entrepreneurial person does. And even if that difference is only incremental, and of course it only will be incremental initially, there's great power in the increment. If you see an opportunity just a little bit differently than I see an opportunity, that might be the difference that makes the difference. That might be the difference that reveals something that hasn't been revealed to the rest of us. So there is the power of an increment, but there's an additional power of an increment, and that is that if I keep intentionally winning the next increment, pretty soon I've accumulated quite a success. So to be intentionally creatively entrepreneurial is to be creatively entrepreneurial, especially when we remind ourselves that there is this natural quality within us that wants to express itself as a creatively entrepreneurial person does. Another place where it's important to practice intentionality is in the language that we use. It's obvious to folks, of course, that our thoughts shape our words. Let's be mindful of how our words shape our subsequent thinking. There is a difference between having an approach that says I'm going to dominate a market from the approach that I would be directed towards if I was going to own a market. When I own a market, when I own something, I want to care for it. I want to nurture it. I want to cultivate it. And I know that any investment I make into that which I own comes back to me. The best way to dominate a market is to try to own a market. Another example of the differences between what I call something is when I see an opportunity, why so frequently will we talk about wanting to take advantage of that opportunity? Now, taking advantage of an opportunity doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to take the best and leave the rest, but we would call that taking advantage of an opportunity. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to tilt the table and change the numbers such that the benefit flows towards me, but we would certainly call that taking advantage of the opportunity. Instead, when we see a creative opportunity, what if we were to say, we're going to try to create advantage from that opportunity? Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to nurture it and cultivate it and find good people to work on it with me and make sure that we're all really delighted by how we're working on this together, but it points me in that direction. Again, I get to win that next increment. So intentionality in the language is so important. And it's also important when you're beginning to identify what's taking place, how I label it is going to subsequently influence the stories that I'm going to begin to tell. And boy, story is such an important quality for an entrepreneur. I teach story as if it were a knowledge management technology because it is exactly that. It is exactly a knowledge management technology. Story will not only tell us what it is that needs to be done, but it tells us how important it is to do it. We've had the capacity for human language for somewhere between 50 and 75,000 years. Anthropologists will demonstrate that our technologies before language are called disposables. We did so little to that stone, so little to that stick, that there was no point in really carrying it around with us. We could create it again as we needed in the moment. Then comes language, then comes story, and immediately thereafter come nets and come baskets and tailored clothing. And it's because the technology of story accelerated the development of other technologies, because story, again, could not only capture the ingredients, the directions of how to build a net, but it could provide the reason why I want to build a net. If I've never built a net before and I'm living a subsistence, barely hanging on to my existence life, it's going to be very difficult for me to engage in any new behavior unless I understand that there's going to be great benefit from it. So the minute we began to understand that story had this incredible quality, we all became storytellers. And if you know anything about the quality of neuroplasticity, about how our brains become what we use our brains to be, our brains for 50,000 years have been shaped to be storytelling devices. So when a group of people come together to work on a project for the first time, if you suggest to them that what you're doing is building a story, creating a brand new story, it's most likely that their best aspects of their creative minds become released, because our minds are storytelling devices. Another really important quality of story that serves me as an entrepreneur is that if I see myself as a storyteller as an entrepreneur, that reminds me to see the marketplace not as a marketplace of customers, but rather as an audience. And the usefulness of that in the early stages of my entrepreneurial effort is it reminds me that there's no point in talking to this audience. There's no point in telling this audience anything unless I have their attention. And the best way to assure that I have their attention is to be attractive. And the best way to be attractive to an audience is to tell them their story. If one of you wanted to go to NYU Law School, and I began to tell you a story right now about how to get into NYU Law School, and as I told you that story, I got up and started to walk out the room, that student would get up out of her chair and follow me down the hall. They will work to help their story come true. When it is something of great significance to them that you're telling them, they'll lean into it. They work just as hard as you do to help that story come true. So the entrepreneur who controls the story shapes the way the marketplace thinks about what's happening and attracts that market to their mission, to the outcome that they're looking to accomplish.